Have you guys ever photographed hummingbirds, or is that something really high on your list? I know for myself, I'm always amazed just seeing photos of them, these amazing colors and that tiny size. But unfortunately, I've only ever been able to see them twice in my life. But every time I see them, I'm just amazed how small they are and just how they dart around from flower to flower. But you, Glenn, you've done a book on hummingbirds. I think you've photographed probably tens of thousands of photos of them. I don't even know if you know how many species of hummingbirds you've photographed, but you're an expert definitely in that field. So what are some tips that people can do that want to photograph hummingbirds? You just stand at a bush of flowers all day long waiting for one?
Well, sometimes you do, but that's not usually the best strategy, to be honest.
Why don't we start where people should go that have never photographed a hummingbird to get some spectacular images of hummingbirds fairly easily?
Well, that's a great idea. Yeah, I mean, hummingbirds only live in the Americas. So basically they range all the way up from sort of Alaska all the way down to Tierra del
Which
Fuego,
is
but they're
not
in the
fair.
Americas and well, they're in the Americas and they're nowhere else, unfortunately. The epicenter of hummingbird diversity is certainly the tropical Andes of South America. So countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, those are definitely the mega biodiverse hotspots. But there's other great places to go too. Places like Costa Rica and Panama, they don't have the same numbers of species, but are kind of smaller countries where it's really nice to photograph them.
So before we get into your technique, could you drop maybe one or two names that someone could look up? Say there's a lodge that has a crazy amount of hummingbirds, for instance. Or of course, they could join one of your workshops and they'll get dozens and dozens of hummingbirds, I presume.
Well, like I said, I mentioned Colombia, and there's lots of places there where we go where we can get a whole bunch of different species. One of my favorites that we often visit on my tours is a place called Las Tangaras, which is a reserve in that kind of middle elevation. And sometimes we can get 10, 15 different species coming into the
Wow,
feeders there,
yeah.
and some really spectacular ones: the velvet purple coronet, the Empress brilliant, the violet-tailed sylph. Not only are they there's a lot of species, but each is so unique and different colors and long tails and little booted tails and all kinds of amazing things.
Ironically, I think for most birds, it's actually harder to get them in flight, whereas with hummingbird, it seems like it's almost easier to get them in flight than get them perched.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, especially obviously if they're coming to a feeder, right? A lot of people don't realize, but hummingbirds are very habitual about their perches. So if you find one and you notice that it goes and lands on a particular branch, even if it flies off, maybe as you approach it flies off, there's actually a really good chance it's going to come back to that same perch. If they're in a territory, they have their favorite perches. And if you just sort of stake it out and wait, there's a really good chance that it might come back.
And so let's say people have a bird feeder in their backyard where hummingbirds are coming to, or they're at a lodge where hummingbirds are coming to the feeder. Would it work to put up a couple perches like next to feeder? Would they use that? Or is that something that doesn't really work?
That can absolutely work. Another thing you can do, I had this one example one time where there was this beautiful swallow-tailed hummingbird in Brazil, and it kept going back to the same perch over and over again, which you'd think, fantastic, you're going to nail a shot.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the perch was a piece of metal sticking out of the ground. But this is the thing, they're so habitual that I just went and looked for a really beautiful little perch and I just strapped it onto the top of that piece of metal. And sure enough, the next time the bird came back, he landed right on my perch and I could get a great shot. Like everything in bird photography, observing the patterns, watching for these sort of patterns. And if you notice that a bird goes back to the same perch a couple times, you might be able to set up and try to get a really good shot there. And sometimes it's really easy and you just set up some perches right near the feeders and next thing you know, they're landing on it.
So when it comes to flight shots, I noticed most of your shots always have a beautiful flower in them. They don't look like they're directly taken at the feeder. What's really the trick in getting these kind of shots?
And sometimes it can be fun to just try to get some really cool dynamic poses of the birds just coming to the feeder and pulling back. A lot of times they'll come in and they'll come out and they'll come in and they'll come out. And sometimes they can be easy to sort of time when they pull back and you can get some really cool poses. That can be really fun. But ultimately, I think you're right. The real wow shots of hummingbirds often are at flowers. And for me, it has to be also an appropriate flower. And then what you can do is put the flower just right near the feeder. And usually what I do is I have a little syringe and I can just take some of the sugar water from the feeder and I put some in the flower. Now, if there's a lot of activity at the feeders, you probably really don't need to do much else. You can just line yourself up with a good background and wait for one to come up to the feeder because they they naturally want to feed there.
I think this is one of those sneaky tricks that people often don't realize are happening, because I think most photos where the hummingbird is coming at a flower, unless it's in a natural environment, it probably has some sugar water in it, simply because otherwise they don't have as much of an incentive to go to that flower.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the shots you see of hummingbirds feeding at flowers are in some ways kind of stage shots, but not always. You know, there are many species of hummingbirds that simply don't go to feeders, and those are always the trickier ones and the more challenging ones to photograph. And it can be actually really fun to do that and really rewarding. But of course, if you have a feeding station where there's 15 different species, maybe 100 individuals coming in, why wouldn't you make it easier on yourself and try to just, set up a shot where you can get spectacular results of many species in one day?
The only flight shots I've ever taken of hummingbirds were actually in natural light, where they're just hovering at the flower, even though I did put some sugar water into the flower. And even at like 8,000ths of a second, it was still sometimes hard to freeze like the action in the wings, because they flip them so hard. So when it comes to hummingbird flight shots, there's definitely two ways people take these shots. Again, there's natural light shots, or you can do like a hardcore setup. Let's say you put a fake background relatively close behind the flower, and then you set up a whole bunch of different flashes around it. And then you use a technique called multi-flash, where you basically illuminate the whole scene with the flashes, right? If you took a shot there without the flash, it would be completely black. So everything is
Yeah.
lit by the flashes, and that allows you then to freeze the wings. Do you have a preferred method of taking them? And has using mirrorless cameras that can shoot at higher ISO, higher shutter speed, helped you in maybe using less multi-flash?
So when I started out and I got really interested in going to the tropics and photographing hummingbirds, I mean, I was shooting with the Canon 10D. I mean, ISO 800 was probably not even usable. And think about before then, people with film cameras, you'd lucky to get ISO 400. You'd have to push your film a stop to get ISO 800. And as I mentioned, most of the hummingbirds live in the cloud forest. Believe it or not, it's cloudy there most of the time. So you simply don't have the shutter speeds to get, you're talking about 8,000th of a second, but I'm even getting 1,000th of a second, you'd be really lucky to get. I would say multi-flash was at one point quite a necessity, where you really couldn't get consistently appropriate light to take flight shots. And so you had to kind of develop this technique. And if you know what you're doing and if you do it well, you can light the scene to make it look natural and use very natural looking backgrounds, to the point where ideally people wouldn't even really know
Yeah.
that it was taken using flash. But that is a tricky thing to do. Now, your question, has it changed? Absolutely. Now, with not only the better sensors, with the faster frame rates, and with great noise reducing software like DxO Pure Raw and Topaz and Adobe Enhance and things like that, my preferred method now is actually to not use multi-flash, to be honest, because you can take full advantage of that 30 frames a second or 20 frames a second, get many more poses. So I think we're moving away from the era of multi-flash. There's certain times when it still might open some doors for you, but I think it's kind of like, yes, it can still be good, but it also presents its own challenges. So why not just look for opportunities to use natural light? And you don't need 8,000th of a second, even 2,000, 2,500, that's plenty. You'll have some movement in the wings, but that can actually look really good. After all,
It depends on the angle though as well, doesn't it? I noticed like in certain
yeah.
angles, you get a lot easier frozen wing than in other angles.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these birds are moving their wings in like a figure-8 pattern like this. And the reason they do that, like most birds only get lift on the downstroke. But hummingbirds, because of the way they move their wings and because of the way their shoulders are, they can actually create lift on the downstroke, and then they turn their wings and they can actually create lift on the upstroke, which is amazing. And that's why they can fly backwards and they can truly hover. So if you've got a camera that can shoot 20 or 30 frames a second and the bird comes into your flower and he's coming in and out and in and out, and you take a bunch of shots, there's a really good chance that you're going to get some good, interesting wing positions.
So that's been a few fantastic tips, and it'd be great to hear from you guys in the comments. Have you been photographing hummingbirds before? Is that a bird that you really want to photograph? Let us know.
Well, enough about hummingbirds already, Jan. I mean, not everybody has access to these beautiful little birds, but most people do have access to some birds. And I think that everybody can possibly work on setting up a little feeding station in their own backyard or a family member's backyard or something. I know you've done this a lot in different places that you've lived. How can people get great shots close to home in their own yards? What are some of the top things that we could recommend to people, do you think?
Yeah, I wish we all had some fancy hummingbirds in our backyard, but that's obviously not the case. But I just like having birds around me and seeing birds. So wherever I've lived, whether it's an apartment with a balcony or a townhouse with a small backyard, or now in a bigger house with a bigger backyard, I've always tried to set up a little station with maybe some food or some water. So I had a few birds coming to me. And I know a lot of people will think they don't have a big backyard, they don't have a good background, it's just a tiny balcony, they can't do anything, but I think that's definitely the wrong approach. Wherever I've lived, I've been able to create some sort of station for the birds where they would come in. Sometimes it might just be sparrows, depending where you live. Like there's just no fancy birds around. But other times where I live now, I have lots of different parrots and really cool pigeons coming into the backyard. And what you really need is just three or four things. You need a position for yourself and your camera. Then you somehow need to have a somewhat distant background, but the distant background could also be like a sheet. For instance, in the little townhouse yard that I used to live, I just put a perch out there, and then I bought a cloth sheet in one of those hardware stores and I spray painted it in different colors, and that gave me a good background. So if you don't have a background, you can also make yourself a background. And then you have just to have a little bowl with food or water for the birds. And then you need to build something that I like to call a 2D tree, which is basically one middle bit of tree, like a tree trunk. It's usually like a metal pole, and that's in some sort of stand. And then I like to have 2 or 4 branches coming out from that tree. And these branches are perfectly aligned with my camera sensor. So even if 15 birds land on that branch, they will all be in focus. The biggest mistake I see people often make when they do a setup is they put a branch here, branch there, they all go in different directions, and then suddenly 4 birds land on the perches, and they're like, oh, they're all not in focus because the perch goes away from the camera, and even at f/22 you wouldn't get all birds in focus. So having all the perches aligned with your sensor is crucially important, and that's why I call it like a 2-dimensional tree.
Sometimes when you're setting up a feeder, the ideal would be these things we've already said, plus some kind of staging trees or bushes that are sort of close to the feeder. It's good to think about a little bit of cover for the birds too, if possible.
Yeah, definitely. I have an ebook where I go into more detail how I set up my perches and what perches to choose. And I also made my video perch where I actually film myself setting up one of these setups and show people how to do it all with the perches. And I
Nice.
built one of my 2D trees. But you're totally right. The more the setup can be near cover, the better it will work. My ideal is if I can basically have a bush on one side, a bush on the other side, and then in the middle between the 2 bushes, I built my 2D tree. So it's almost like
Yeah.
the branches coming out of the bush. Or in this case, if the bushes are close together, you could scrap the 2D tree as well and directly cable tile some perches coming out of the bushes. So the bird can fly into the tree and then boop, 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 hop out of the
Yeah.
bush onto your feeder, which can work very well as well.
That's ideal for sure. Well, hopefully you guys found some good tips there for setting up your own backyards or maybe from photographing hummingbirds in your own backyard even. So I think now it's time for the editing tweak of the week.
As you can see, Glenn and I usually like to have a plan when it comes to photographing birds. Maybe we set up something or we go to a spot where the birds are so we know we can be successful. So it only comes natural that we have a plan when it comes to image editing as well. Is that right?
Photoshop can be an intimidating program. There's so many different things and filters and tools and everything. And I think people just get sort of overwhelmed with the options. But what you really need is sort of a good plan. I think both of us sort of have like a sort of general workflow that we probably do more or less similar things on every photo.
Definitely. And when you say use similar tools, you don't necessarily mean you do the same thing with the same tool to every single photo, but you use the same
No, of
tool
course.
to do very different things to each photo. But it's always just maybe 5 different tools you use every single time on every photo. But before we actually use the tools, I think it's very important that we actually start out with a plan on what we want to do to the
Yes.
photo or identify the areas that need adjusting before we even start editing.
Absolutely. I think it would be a great thing for most people when you open a photo in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever you're using to edit, is to literally just take your hand off the mouse and take 10 seconds and look at the photo and say, this is what I'm trying to do, basically. I want to make the subject a bit brighter, darken up the background. I'm going to clone that little stick out, and I'm going to maybe add some saturation here and there. And at least you kind of have a plan. And then you can sort of, okay, well, what tools do I have to allow me to do that? Or better yet, how much of that can I get done through my basic workflow? And then what will I need to do kind of additionally at the end with these sort of special tools?
And that's a great tip because this stops you from over editing, because that's a disease that
Yes,
plagues me from time to time. It probably plagues you. You start
for sure.
editing
When do
and
you stop?
there isn't an end really. You could, any photo
No.
I've ever edited, I could open again and could find another 3 layers to add or take one away. So you have to get to a point where you think, yes, I've done well. I'm
Yeah.
finished now.
So basically, in summary, it's really important to have a game plan when you go into the digital darkroom. It's a great idea before you start editing to look at the image and kind of think about what you want to do with it. And we think it's absolutely a must to have some kind of basic workflow that you work through on just about every photo. And you can always add more tools to your toolbox of success. We've got some great resources for you. If you want to learn how Jan edits his photos, how I edit my photos, check out the links down in the description. Jan's masterclass, my ebooks, those will definitely help you to develop your own workflow, save time, and get great results.
So you mentioned a basic workflow already, or certain tools we use all the time. And for me, I definitely have the same order of things I use as well. So for instance, I will find a raw file to edit. I open it up in Camera Raw. I run noise reduction on the file. In this case, I'd use Adobe Enhance because I'm already in Camera Raw, but you can also use DxO Pure Raw. Then I select the profile, usually one of our presets to get the colors and the balance right in the raw file. I make more adjustments if needed. Then I'll open the photo in Photoshop. And from there, I usually run 4 different adjustment layers and a variety of different things. I will use levels, I'll use curves, I'll use maybe color balance, but usually not. I'll definitely use hue saturation, I will use selective color. And these 5 things will usually get me to where I need to go.
There's no need to sort of reinvent the wheel with every photo, right? Like we basically want to do those same things, and then you get to the end of that, and then that's when you might start doing any cloning, fixing up little feathers here. This would be a great time to open up some of the brushes in our brush pack, for example. If you find a little area that needs some more saturation or needs a little bit more contrast, or maybe you need to color in some feathers, that's when we would do that stuff, not at the beginning. That's the sort of really fine tuning of the image at the end. And not everybody would necessarily want to do that. Some people would just do the basic workflow, stop, done, and that's fine.
So in the end, it really matters that you know what tools are there, how do I use the tools, and how do I get the best results with the tools that are available to me. And in the end, that doesn't have to be that many different tools. There's probably 1,000 different tools in Photoshop or 1,000 different ways to do things, but you can often get away with just doing 5 things and get like a fantastic result.
Okay, well, with that said, all about processing, I think now maybe we're going to look at some other people's processing in everyone's favorite segment, the photo of the week.
Surprise, surprise, the first photo I brought today is of a hummingbird, and you can help me with the
Appropriate.
species on that one. All I can say, it has a very long tail and a green body.
Very long tail, and indeed it is the black-tailed train bearer from the high Andes of, probably this one is probably in Colombia or Ecuador, I would imagine.
And I thought it was a really nice photo, beautiful bird with a nice background, a decent pulse. Maybe you could have a tiny bit more head turn, but I think overall that's very good. And the only thing when it comes to the editing, I think you could maybe work on the bird's face slightly, brightening that up to make it stand out a little bit more. And then I also think there's definitely too much purple in the wings.
Yeah, so here's an example where I actually think Ishmael has done a really good job over here editing this image. And we talked about the workflow steps. So if you got to this stage and then you need 2 brushes from our brush pack. One would be to brighten an area, and you could brighten up the face a little bit. And then we have a clean up the blacks, and you could clean up the wings. That would remove the purple cast from the wings. So it would literally be click, paint, done. And that would really help you to just improve the colors a little bit in this image. The other thing that's challenging, obviously, with any bird that has some like freakishly long bill or tail or whatever, composition becomes probably the biggest challenge, and the interaction between the perch and the bird, right? So here we kind of have basically creating this cross because we have the perch and we have the bird, and sometimes with these types of very long-tailed hummingbirds, it's actually really helpful to have like a very angular perch, or a perch that has another side branch coming off of it to help with balancing out the composition. Because here I feel like we have a lot of negative space. How do you feel about the composition?
It's quite ironic because usually you don't see perches that fit a small bird like a hummingbird in size this well. Like this perch is the perfect choice. It's a nice thin perch, but at the same time, it wasn't set up in the right way. You probably need a more steep perch for a bird like this. I'm saying it's a setup perch because I can see some sort of snipped off bits on the perch, so I assume it was placed there. This will be something we would edit out as well, so we don't have these snipped off ends
Yeah.
there. But in this case, the perch actually makes the composition quite difficult. And here's one more tip when it comes to setups. First of all, we want to find perches that are somewhat interesting, maybe gnarly. We want to find perches that are appropriate in the size to the birds that we want to photograph. That's done here well as well. Like no problems with the perch itself. But if we had an upright perch, it would allow us to crop the image much better and actually show off more of the bird.
All right, so the first image I've brought for us this week is by Wasuv Gallery, and it's of this beautiful looking fairy pitta. And I think I really like just about everything about this image, but maybe one thing could be improved. What do you think that might be, Jan?
Just looking at this photo now, I think it has a very nice background. The editing overall is done pretty well as well. There's good details in the bird, also in that really bright blue patch on the wing that usually blows out when you're photographing pitta. So it's good to have the detail in there. The only thing that slightly lets it down for me is that sort of rock, that just a pretty plain faced rock, pretty bright as well. So if we can't do anything about the rock, at the very least, I would probably use our darken area brush and just brush a couple times over the bottom of the image, so that at least allow me to have the perch darker than the bird. Because currently, if you looked at the histogram, you'd see areas of the rock are actually brighter than the brightest areas in the bird. And that kind of draws your focus to the rock rather than the pitta.
I mean, definitely the perch is the one part of this image that I think could really use some improvement. So if this was just a wild bird that just jumped up on the rock and you got a shot, then what can you do? But if you were maybe if there was a way to somehow get this bird on a different perch, then I think that would really take it to the next level. So something to consider for the next time, but overall a great shot. So Jan, what's your next image?
So the next image I brought is of this flying crab plover, and I basically love everything about it. Great light, fantastic background that shows enough of the habitat without being distracting at all. And the bird is so high in the photo as well that we get a bit of the beach at the bottom, but then we get it mostly in the blue ocean and the blue sky. So it's not cut in half by anything. And we're also lucky that the transition from the sky to the ocean is so smooth that it just looks like one blue area. But I just think it's a fantastic shot, fabulous banking pose as well. There's really not much I would do at all.
Yeah, it's a stunner. This one by, I guess it's Cade Warshak. What makes this shot, I think, for me, is the pose. I mean, amazing banking pose and a really cool, the back of the bird is really interesting looking.
Yeah.
The feet kind of sticking out straight, and you get still that nice eye contact. So overall, an awesome shot. All right, my next image this week is by Kenny Diaz J. And it's of this beautiful swallow. I actually don't know what species of swallow. It looks like it's maybe a Caribbean species, perhaps. But it's a really stunning looking swallow. I thought our violet green swallows here were pretty beautiful, and they are, but this is a really beautiful one as well. They've done a good job getting this bird on a really interesting little perch with a nice kind of head turn. What do you think about this one, Jan?
I think it's a crazy looking swallow. I tried to Google it just then. I think it's called a golden swallow. Correct us in the comments if we are wrong, because nothing is golden on this bird at all. So I think it should be something like a brew green shiny swallow or something. But let's move on from that. I think it's a fantastic image. The light seems to be somewhat tricky. It almost seems to come from above and behind the bird. So I'm trying to figure out how it works, but it actually does work. And they did a good job in lightening the shadow on the throat of the bird and sort of the face. So we have a good detail in that. And I could see this image cropped a little bit tighter because I feel like in a weird way, even though it's a nice perch, it's almost overwhelming also because it doesn't have any colors of the birds in it. So it's like a very different shaped and styled perch to the bird. So I think That could definitely be cropped a little bit tighter, but other than that, I think it's a really nice photo.
And it's interesting you mentioned like the lighting and sort of, how to handle, there's obviously like a transition where part of the bird's white neck is brighter than the other part. And I think they've done a reasonable job of kind of,
Yeah,
taking out the darkest shadows. But this is the kind of thing where you could try to kind of blend and not have that hard line,
yeah.
and then sort of continue to brighten the shadowy part of the neck, and just try to create a more smooth transition so that your eye is not really drawn to that lighting challenge. And also maybe that sort of like collar where the birds, it almost looks like it's missing feathers, but it's probably just because of the angle of the neck turn is sort of changing some of the
Yeah.
feathers. But that's where I would maybe consider like working on that area a little bit, just to kind of make that neck overall a little bit cleaner.
Clone tool at 50% opacity will be your friend there. The last image I brought is by Marcus Ballmann of this lapwing in flight, and I think it's a beautiful image. We have a fantastic pose of the wings and the rest of the body. I'm saying that because I wish it would have a hat turn that's looking at me a little bit more, because it's kind of already doing the bank away from me. So either I wanted to see the photo 2 frames before this one where it's almost fully sideways to me, or get this one but maybe have a different hat turn. But overall, I think it's another fantastic image. The background's also good, give us a little sense of the habitat.
Yeah, and look, not everybody has a Sony A9 that can shoot at 120 frames a second, okay? So just give it a rest. Yeah, I think it's a really cool shot. It's interesting, the wing shape of this bird, how they're kind
Yeah,
of narrower and then they go out wider. It's quite interesting. And this image shows that off really cool. That's always a neat thing in bird photography, when a bird has a particular feature or a kind of an anomaly. Like that's a weird looking wing for a bird.
yeah.
That's not a normal wing. And the image highlights that and it shows that off. And I think that's a really cool aspect of photography, when you can really highlight the feature of a bird. So I think I totally get what you're saying about the head turn, but overall I think it's a great shot by Marcus, and I'd be more than happy to have that one in my collection.
And it's actually interesting you mentioned the wings, because that's a big feature of the birds. When you see them flying like Europe, they do flap their wings a lot, also as part of like displaying or chasing away predators. So having that odd wing shape is definitely a big part of the bird. And we love photos that show off the main feature or the main characteristic of the bird. So
Yeah.
definitely well done, great photo.
All right, my last image this week that I've brought for us is by Hari Patibanda, and it's of this curious black-throated bush tit, and I think it is indeed looking very curious. I mean, sometimes images of the bird looking right at you can be kind of weird, but with one like this that has this cool kind of like band across its chin, and it's a cute looking little bird. It's a really interesting pose looking straight at the camera. The perch I like with the sort of the thorns on it. It's like almost like a rose bush or something like that. There's one thing that would be ideal if we had a little bit more.
Depth of field, or what I said previously, if you set up this perch, I don't know if it's set up or not, but that's what I was saying before. Build a 2D tree and set it up in perfect alignment to your sensor, because then you don't have the issue like here where the picture in the front is sharp, half of the bird is sharp, but then it drifts off into an out of focus foot and an out of focus perch. So if we can avoid it with more depth of field, which would probably be possible here because the background looks like it's really distant, would not only give us more depth of field on the perch and the foot, but also on the tail. So we can either do that or set up the perch more in line with the camera, or align yourself more with the perch if you're in the field, and you get more sharpness on the bird or more depth of field on the bird.
It's always important to remember when you're doing setups, if you're using a super telephoto lens here, which it looks like Hari was using a 500 with a 1.4 converter, the closer you are to the subject, the less depth of field you have. So if you're at your sort of minimum focus distance with a tiny little bird like this, you've got such a small amount of depth of field that sometimes it can't be prevented. You don't have enough light to stop down or whatever, but sometimes it can. And I'm guilty of this myself. In the tropics, sometimes you don't have a lot of light and you would love to have that little bit more depth of field. Or if you stop down, the background's that little bit closer and you start to get more texture. So it can be a balancing act, but it's just something to consider, whether how you're setting up your perch and how you're using your settings. If possible, it would be nice to have a bit more depth of field in that tail.
And there's one more thing we talk about in a lot of images, and that's a pretty prevalent purplish blue color cast in this photo. I assume most of the parts of this bird will be gray, and even in the red on the head, there's sort of a magenta, purple, blue tinge as well. So I'd definitely go in there either with color balance or selective color in the neutral channel and just slide that a bit around so that blue color, the magenta color is gone. Or you could also go into hue saturation, desaturate the purples and the magentas and brush that at least on the wing into blacks and the white. Because what we always say, if something is black, gray or white, it should be black, gray or white and not somehow blue or somehow magenta, and it will make the image look much sharper and much crisper.
Yeah. So this maybe is a good kind of just to come back to our tweak of the week. So when you're making that plan, maybe you want to look at, especially if it's a bird with black or white or gray, or am I picking up a color cast here and what can I do about it? So
Yeah.
whether that's in your initial raw editing with the tint or the white balance, or whether you need to go in more selectively and pull out some saturation or the color, there's different ways you can do it because it can be really easily overlooked when you're just thinking about
Yeah.
sharpness and composition and overall exposure. It's really easy. And I find myself very often where I'll like have edited some photos one day and then I go and look at them a few days later and I'm like, oh shoot, I got to go back and fix those colors
Yeah.
because you didn't see it at the time. You know, you were so focused on cloning that stick or whatever, but then you look at it later. And that's another maybe good tip is like after you've edited your images, before you unleash them into the world, take a few days and then look at them with a fresh set of eyes. Sometimes can be a good idea. And maybe some of these things, you know, might jump out at you.
And I think that's a fantastic way to finish this week's episode of the Bird Photography Show. We hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear all your thoughts in the comments. Of course, give us a thumbs up for the video. Hit that subscribe button, and we will see you guys very soon. Bye.
Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.